Okay, so this is my first time talking about the history and media portrayals of a historical figure who is neither king nor queen. Titanic and Pearl Harbor don't count because they're events. I think if I want to make a series about the people of the Tudor court who, while not royal, still played significant roles in how events played out and influenced what decisions were made, I would call it Typecast Tudors. Because believe it or not, a lot of the time, these people are only presented in one light, and very few decide to diverge from the norm. Jane Rochford, we're looking at you. These will be a bunch of one and done projects, as in everything is included in one video, especially because they are typically always portrayed the same way. Kicking the series off is Mary Boleyn, sister to Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, who did not gain much in the way of wealth, titles, or even a long-lasting legacy. Nonetheless, her presence remained a reminder of Henry VIII's whims, be they vindictive or simply indifferent. Had she not existed, he would not have been able to declare the future Elizabeth I illegitimate and spark the succession crisis of the mid-16th century. Was Mary just another bump in the road, or an underrated player in the Tudor court? Once again, there is a struggle to determine the true time of birth for Mary Boleyn. This was at a time when dates of birth were not officially recorded unless one was of royal birth. If the Boleyn family did keep records of their children's births, they have likely been lost, as the Boleyns are now considered an extinct surname. The first sources of the Boleyn family appear in the mid-13th century and is believed to have been derived from the French territory of Boulogne. Pronunciation and the spelling of names changes over time, especially in an age long before there was an official spelling for the English language. Over the years, the family rose in influence, becoming mayors, sheriffs and aldermen. The first Boleyn to be knighted was Sir Geoffrey, who would become Lord Mayor and Sheriff of London during the reign of King Henry VI. It was here that the estates of Blickling Hall in Norfolk and Hever Castle in Kent were purchased. The Boleyns were now official gentry. His son, William Boleyn, was made a Knight of the Bath at Richard III's coronation. So from this I gather that the Boleyns were on the Yorkist side during the Wars of the Roses. However, after Richard III's defeat at Bosworth Field, they would have sworn loyalty to the new Tudor regime, and Sir William Boleyn was appointed responsibility of guarding the beacons on the coast to warn of potential invasions. He married Margaret Butler, daughter of the Earl of Ormond. And that brings us to Thomas Boleyn, Mary's father. He was the first Boleyn to claim noble blood through his mother's heritage. With the Boleyns having gained much support and confidence from the Howards of Norfolk over the years, he married the eldest daughter of the then Duke of Norfolk, Elizabeth Howard, sometime before the end of the 15th century. Mary herself is believed to have been the eldest child, born in either 1499 or 1500. Her two surviving siblings, Anne and George, were thought to have been born after Mary. However, conflicting sources as to when the three were born may suggest that Anne might have been the oldest, with Mary either the youngest or the middle child. Despite popular belief, the Boleyn children were not born at Hever Castle. Instead, they were all born at Blickling Hall, due to them being the second generation of Boleyns with noble blood, and Blickling itself having a long history of royalty dating back to the Norman conquest. Seeing as Mary was the first to be sent overseas and represent the family at the French court, while Anne was given a more private education in the Netherlands, along with Mary being the first to come to the English court and marry, suggests that she might have been the older sister. Mary received the typical education given to that of all young ladies in the Tudor era: writing, sewing, music and horseback, along with the graces and religious virtues expected of a demure, obedient wife. However, their father encouraged both Mary and Anne to study further in the way their brother was learning, something which Anne embraced. It is not clear if Mary felt the same way. Being an emissary, Thomas Boleyn gained connections, first in the Netherlands and later in France. We know that Anne was sent to the court of the Archduchess Margaret of Austria sometime around 1513. We have a visitor. It's Louis! I thought you'd be Alan. It's raining, isn't it? I can tell you've been outside. You know, you can stay if you like. I always appreciate having a bit of purring in the background. No? Okay. Go back to your box then. Meanwhile, Henry VIII had secured a marriage alliance for his younger sister, Mary Tudor the Elder. Not to be confused with the Mary who would then become Mary I. Different Mary. I have to keep asserting this because sometimes people forget there are two Mary Tudors. She was to be married to the 52-year-old King Louis XII. For the 18-year-old princess, she would be assigned a retinue of English ladies to take with her. Thomas Boleyn, being a prominent English diplomat, had enough clout to get not one, but both of his daughters accepted to serve the future Queen of France. With Anne still in the Netherlands, Mary travelled to the French court without her sister. Upon arrival, the king disliked the size of the princess's entourage and had many of them sent back to England. Mary Boleyn, however, was one of the few who remained, and she could look forward to a new life being swooned over by rich French suitors. Unfortunately, after only a few short months of marriage, King Louis died. The young queen was required, through tradition, to isolate herself with her attendants for 40 days. The French court waited with bated breath to see if she was with child. Mary would have been with her mistress at this time. The French throne was succeeded by Louis's cousin and son-in-law, Francois I, who wanted to use the widowed queen to his advantage by marrying her off to one of his allies. Francois I was one of those kings who would become infamous mostly for his womanizing, and also letting his two eldest sons be exchanged for him as hostages in Spain and leaving them for dead, but that's another story. Look at my Catherine de Medici video. He would die of his resultant STDs, and just a handful of months after Henry VIII for that matter. Before she returned to England, Princess Mary and her ladies left isolation and mingled in the court once more. During this span of time, it is believed that King Francois took Mary Boleyn, who would have been at most 15 or 16, as his mistress, or rather one of his many conquests as opposed to his Mistress en titre, a title held by Francois de Foix. He infamously described Mary as a great prostitute and infamous above all others, along with such affectionate nicknames as my English mare. Princess Mary averted being used for the gains of other men by marrying her brother's best friend Charles Brandon, the newly made Duke of Suffolk. They returned to England together, where it is believed that Mary either left the court with her mistress or remained in France until 1519, while Anne stayed behind for a few more years. There doesn't appear to have been much fallout from Mary's relationship with the King of France, however consensual it might have been. A noblewoman losing her virginity outside of marriage was scandalous, but there was always a slight double standard if it happened to be with a king. Regardless of what the Boleyn family now thought of their daughter, Mary would be welcomed at the English court to serve Queen Catherine of Aragon. One of the biggest things Mary Boleyn was known for was being mistress to Henry VIII, before he even acknowledged the existence of her sister. When he began pursuing her remains a mystery, but it appears to have happened close to 1520, around the same time Mary married the courtier and gentleman of the Privy Chamber, William Carey. The wedding was attended by Henry VIII himself. This might have been because the Boleyns were high in favour with the king, where Sir Thomas was serving as the ambassador to France. William Carey, however, was not the greatest match, seeing as he was a second son, and thus not expected to inherit his father's property, and only had a manor in Devon. It may have been that her family arranged this match in order to patch up the blot on Mary's name and restore some sort of credibility to her. Another possibility is that Henry had decided in advance that he wanted to pursue Mary. He had already sired an illegitimate son with Bessie Blount, and had only married her off after she had given birth, before she disappeared into obscurity. If Mary were married and Henry had sired children with her, he had plausible deniability. Indeed, this is what happened. Not long after her marriage to Carey, Mary would become Henry's mistress. In this time she would have two children, Catherine, born in 1524, and Henry, born in 1526. Due to Mary being married at the time, no one can say for sure if her children were Henry VIII's or William Carey's. Mary remained a lady-in-waiting to Catherine, and accompanied the court to the Field of the Cloth of Gold in June of 1520, where she would have reunited with Anne. The gathering of both the French and English courts, which was meant to promote a peaceful treaty, ultimately failed in the long term, and the English began to cosy up to the Spanish Emperor Charles V once more. Anne Boleyn, as a result, was recalled home, where her parents and uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, wished for her to marry James Butler in order to unite the bickering heirs to the Earldom of Ormond, which Sir Thomas Boleyn thought was rightfully his. To marry into an earldom was a much more advantageous match than the one Mary had made. While Mary was mistress of the king, this might have sparked a flavour of bitterness between the sisters. At the Chateau Vert pageant in 1522, where Anne Boleyn famously played Perseverance, Mary Boleyn played the role of Kindness. 1526 is the year in which Henry VIII began his initial pursuit of Anne Boleyn. It isn't clear when he stopped sleeping with Mary, or why he did so, but it is clear that the Boleyns were still in his good graces for him to pursue the other daughter. Anne refused Henry's advances, and it wasn't until the start of 1527 that she declared she would not sleep with him unless they were married, that Henry VIII began the king's great matter. The Boleyns and their allies continued to rise as Henry VIII sought a way to annul his marriage with Catherine of Aragon. Mary was by her sister's side the entire time, with Henry claiming his marriage was invalid due to Catherine supposedly consummating her first marriage with his brother Arthur. Mary's presence would have been an indicator at the king's glaring hypocrisy. Clearly, if he had slept with Anne's sister, he could never legally be married to her, could he?
Shut up.
Well, you see, Henry actually had the audacity to not only ask for an annulment from the Pope, but to also request a dispensation so he could marry Anne. In the late 1520s, England endured one of its worst outbreaks of the dreaded sweating sickness. Both Anne Boleyn and Cardinal Wolsey contracted the sickness, but managed to survive. However, William Carey would succumb on the 22nd of June 1528. Mary was, presumably, at her husband's side when he passed. William Carey died deep in debt, and it was passed on to Mary after his death. Anne reached out to help her sister. Fatherless sons from noble families were typically taken into the custody of the crown, and Henry Carey was educated in a Cistercian monastery with Anne as his primary caretaker. She also procured the French poet Nicholas Bourbon as a tutor for him. To help pay off her husband's debts, Anne procured a pension of £100 a year for her sister, which rounds up to about $59,000 today. Mary would continue to accompany her sister wherever she went, including to Calais, where Henry and Francois would meet on good terms for the first time since the Field of the Cloth of Gold. It was in Calais that Mary lightly met William Stafford, a relative of the executed Duke of Buckingham. Mary would have been at her sister and Henry's private marriage ceremonies, as well as Anne's glamorous coronation. She may also have been present for the birth of her niece, Elizabeth, on the 7th of September 1533. In 1534, Mary secretly married William Stafford. The secret part did not last long, as Mary was last seen at the Tudor court, visibly pregnant. It isn't known if Mary became pregnant before or after her marriage. Either way, this would have been seen as a monumental embarrassment for the Boleyn faction. Not only had Mary married without royal permission, if she had indeed conceived out of wedlock, she was dredging up the reputation given to her from her days in France and as Henry's mistress. Eustace Chapuis, the English ambassador, who always kept a close eye on Anne Boleyn to report her vices back to his master, noted in a report made in December 1534 that the lady's sister was also banished from court 3 months ago, but it was necessary to do so, for besides that she had been found guilty of misconduct, it would not have been becoming to see her at court enceinte. It was around the summer of 1534 that Anne Boleyn suffered her first miscarriage or stillbirth. The trauma of this, now made more painful at seeing the ease with which her sister managed to become pregnant, along with the possibility that she may have borne Henry a son while Anne had failed, all but destroyed their relationship. Mary and her husband were banished from the court. She would be cut off from her family's money, which greatly affected her finances. Desperate to reconcile, Mary sent 2 letters to Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's right-hand man, hoping he would plead her case. Only one of the letters survives today. Master Secretary, after my poor recommendations, which is smally to be regarded of me, that am a poor banished creature, this shall be to desire you to be good to my poor husband and to me. I am sure it is not unknown to you the high displeasure that both he and I have, both of the King's Highness and the Queen's Grace, by reason of our marriage without their knowledge, wherein we both do yield ourselves faulty, and do acknowledge that we did not well to be so hasty or so bold, without their knowledge. But one thing, good Master Secretary, Consider that he was young, and love overcame reason. And for my part, I saw so much honesty in him, that I loved him as well as he did me, and was in bondage, and glad I was to be at liberty. So that for my part, I saw that all the world did set so little by me, and he so much, that I thought I could take no better way, but to take him and to forsake all other ways, and live a poor honest life with him. And so I do put no doubts, but we should, if we might once be so happy to recover the king's gracious favour, and the queen's. For well, I might have had a greater man of birth, and a higher, but I assure you, I could never have had one that should have loved me so well, nor a more honest man. And besides that, he is both come of an ancient stock, and as again we meet, if it was in his grace's pleasure, to do the king's service as any young gentleman in his court. Therefore, good Master Secretary, this shall be my suit to you, that, for the love that well I know you do bear to all my blood, though for my part I have not deserved it, but smallly by reason of my vile conditions, as to put my husband to the king's grace, that he may do his duty, as all other gentlemen do. And, good Master Secretary, sue for us to the king's highness, and beseech his highness, which was ever wont to take pity, to have pity on us, and that it will please his grace of his goodness to speak to the queen's grace for us. For, so far as I can perceive, her grace is so highly displeased with us, that, without the king to be so good lord to us, as to withdraw his rigour and sue for us, we are never like to recover her grace's favour, which is too heavy to bear. And seeing as there is no remedy, for God's sake help us. For we have been now a quarter of a year married, I thank God, and too late now to call that again, wherefore it is the more alms to help. But if I were at my liberty and might choose, I assure you, master, for my little time, I have tried so much honesty to be in him, that I rather beg my bread with him, than to be the greatest queen in Christendom. And I believe verily he is in the same case with me. For I believe verily he would not forsake me to be a king. Therefore, good Master Secretary, seeing as we are so well together, and does intend to live so honest a life, though it be but poor, show part of your goodness to us, as well as you do the world besides, for I promise you, you have the name to help all them that hath need. And amongst all your suitors, I dare be bold to say that you have no matter more to be pitied than ours. And therefore, for God's sake, be good to us, for in you is all our trust. And I beseech you, good Master Secretary, pray my lord my father and my lady to be so good to us, and to let me have their blessings and my husband their goodwill, and I will never desire more of them. Also I pray you, desire my lord of Norfolk and my lord brother to be good to us. I dare not write to them, they are so cruel against us, but if, with any pain that I could take with my life, I might win their good wills. I promise you, there is no child living would venture more than I, and so I pray you to report by me, and you shall find my writing true, and in all points, which I may please them in, I shall be ready to obey them, nearest my husband, whom I am most bound to whom I most heartily beseech you to be good unto, which for my sake is a poor banished man, for an honest and godly cause. And seeing that I have read in old books that some, for as just causes, have by kings and queens been pardoned by the suit of good folks, I trust it shall be our chance, through your good help, to come to the same. As knoweth the Lord God, who send you health and heart's ease, scribbled with her ill hand, who is your poor, humble suitor, always to command. Mary Stafford. It is not known if Cromwell ever replied to Mary, or if he did speak to the king on her behalf. However, Anne appeared to have relented, if only a little, to send her sister a gold cup and some money. There are no more sources hinting that Mary and Anne ever fully reconciled or saw each other again before May of 1536. It is almost certain that Mary never returned to court or ever saw her niece. Having failed to give Henry a son, Henry had Anne Boleyn, along with her brother and a handful of nobles, accused of adultery and treason, and tried in a kangaroo court, where they were all, save for the poet Thomas Wyatt, found guilty and executed. Before her death, however, Henry sought to annul his marriage to Anne by claiming that because he had slept with Mary, their marriage was invalid, thus disinheriting the Princess Elizabeth. But then, of course, Anne couldn't possibly have committed adultery if she wasn't married to Henry.
Shut up!
Had Mary visited either sibling in the Tower, it would almost certainly have been recorded, as Anne was watched closely during her imprisonment as a way of incriminating her. Thomas Boleyn is recorded as still being present at court, albeit at a much reduced capacity, conceding most of the favours he was given back to the crown. The though he did get to keep his earldoms of Ormond and Wiltshire. He submitted to the punishments of those involved in the Pilgrimage of Grace, and he was present for the christening of the future Edward VI. He would pass away in 1539. His wife Elizabeth, who had died a year prior, was buried with the Howards at Lambeth, while Thomas was buried at St. Peter's Church near Hever Castle. Mary and Stafford lived in various places around England, including Staffordshire, Essex, Kent and Yorkshire. At some point they might have lived in Calais as well. Even though Mary was noted to have been pregnant in her last public appearance at court, there is little to no record on the children she may have had with Stafford. A son, Edward, died in 1545, aged 10. Meanwhile, a second child, a girl named Anne, likely died in infancy. Painful memories about her sister likely rose to the surface in 1542, when news broke of the downfall and execution of Henry's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, along with Mary's sister-in-law, Jane Parker. Barely 3 weeks after Henry VIII had married his sixth wife, Catherine Parr, Mary Boleyn passed away at Rochford Hall on the 30th of July, 1543. Her cause of death and place of burial is unknown. Mary's surviving children, Henry and Catherine Carey, went on to enjoy prosperous careers at the court of Elizabeth I. Catherine served as chief lady of the bedchamber, while Henry became a baron. Elizabeth gave him the earldom of Ormond on his deathbed. To this day, the descendants of Mary Boleyn are numerous. Most notable among them are Charles Darwin, Princess Diana, and the current Princess of Wales, Kate Middleton, wherever she may be.
Thomas, perhaps your daughters might attend my sister as her ladies, as we journey to France for the wedding.
Mary, Anne, the King honours us all.
My name is Mary Boleyn. I have a brother George and a sister Anne. I am married to a man named William Carey. What I wish for the future is to have children, at least 4.
Your Majesty, I'm told I'm too late for my brother George. I beg you, spare my sister.
Here we go. This is what my audience is expecting. It is time to talk about both adaptations of The Other Boleyn Girl. But I also have to touch on, however briefly, what little we saw of Mary in The Spanish Princess. None of these 3 adaptations are good, and the books they're based on ain't much better. But I think The Other Boleyn Girl still remains Philippa Gregory's most popular novel. I must certify right away that this is in no way meant to attack Gregory herself. Not everything she writes is terrible, and in The Spanish Princess's case, even she thought stars had gone too far. My ire leads more towards the adaptations, because they're just badly made overall. A part of me was filled with dread because when I started listing the Mary Boleyns from my database, there was a voice that said, you know, if you cover Mary Boleyn, you're gonna have to finish The Spanish Princess. And I protested bitterly because that Flodden episode was so stupid. How on earth was I going to get further from there? Tell you what though, having reached the end of the Gregory-verse only makes me more determined to make a redux of my videos of Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. I have so much more to rant about now. I anticipated the usual stuff to happen to Mary in the 2nd season. Both sisters are introduced early on, being proposed as ladies-in-waiting to Princess Mary when she agrees to be sent to France. Throughout the season, they don't actually reveal that these are the Boleyns though. Thomas is referred to by his first name, or as Wiltshire, and it isn't until the final episode where Margaret Pole confronts him that it is suddenly revealed that this is a Boleyn. This is Thomas Boleyn, the father of Anne Boleyn. Ooh, I wonder what will happen. So I guess if you literally knew nothing about the Boleyns except the name or the order of the wives, then this would have been a surprise. But to the more historically savvy, it works as a kind of dramatic irony. Anne Boleyn herself is treated like Wolsey in The White Princess, where they were an ever-present figure who slowly becomes more and more noticeable before their true prevalence is revealed. This means she's not at the French court. Mary Boleyn, meanwhile, played by Bessie Coates, mysteriously disappears, with scenes showing Catherine catching Henry with Bessie Blount and Anne Boleyn. There ought to have been another scene with Mary between those two. You know, rule of 3. There are frequent instances of Thomas telling his daughter to do this and that in order to get a little bit further up that ladder. But Mary is never seen again. I don't know if there are any deleted scenes, but it feels as though a huge chunk of history has been cut out. My guess is that for a lot of these dramas that are on the lesser side of quality. They're afraid of having more than one character with the same name, because there's already Princess Mary, so you can't really get rid of her, can you? Because, oh no, they'll be confused if there's two characters called Mary. And granted, not many nicknames can be made out of Mary. Maybe if there was a couple more episodes there would have been room for her. There was barely enough breathing space for her sister. The Spanish Princess came to an end after 2 seasons, and there may have been plans to go further into the Tudor era, but Philippa Gregory vetoed Starz adapting any more of her works. I'm not even sure if Starz has the right to the other Boleyn girl, or if they're still with Universal. Let's start with the novel. The biggest thing that isn't adapted into either film is that Gregory moves some things around so that at the start of the novel, Mary is meant to be 13. Anne was the only one sent to the French court, while Mary stayed at home. She never met King Francois and was a virgin on her wedding night. The novel really, really hates Anne Boleyn, by the way. So do the movies. Also in the novel, Henry VIII is the biological father of both Mary's children, which is another thing not covered in the films. But they do feature Anne being tasked with making sure Henry doesn't wander from Mary, only to seize an opportunity and get him to pursue her instead. While they're waiting for the annulment, Mary has to sleep with Henry again to keep his urges satisfied. Mary attempts to plead for Anne's life and gets to visit her in the tower, but Henry lies about promising to spare Anne, and the execution goes forward. She elopes with William Stafford and gets her own happily ever after. So the BBC made a ludicrously boring adaptation of the novel in 2003, with Natasha McElhone playing Mary. This is probably by pure default the top of the list when it comes to actresses who played Mary Boleyn, but mostly because there's not much else to rival it. Maybe Wolf Hall. It follows the events of the book closely but takes a few liberties in order to tie it back to historical roots. Obviously, no decent producer would ever cast a 13-year-old for this, so both Mary and Anne are aged up and being played by adult women. They also verbally confirm that Mary is the older sister. When Anne backstabs her sister, it's basically her revenge for Mary snitching about her and Henry Percy. The 2008 movie also has this rift between the sisters, and they struggle to patch up their affection before the end. Stafford is rewritten to be a servant of the Boleyns. A high-up servant, but a servant nonetheless. Of course, it would not be Philippa Gregory without incest. In this movie, it's followed through, but Mary is the one to suggest it. And yet, she's the one who gets off scot-free and lives happily ever after. Despite it being technically more accurate in terms of location and costuming, I really cannot stand this movie. It's just so boring and badly paced. Natasha's performance barely carries the narrative to its end. The plot at its core is mostly Mary doing practically nothing, while things happen to her and around her. It's difficult to get a strong protagonist out of that. To be honest, she's always given me the impression of an English teacher who won't actually say anything about your coursework, but will write out all her disappointment in the notes before she gives you a C. Now on to the 2008 movie, which I remember watching on repeat. It was my gateway drug into my Tudor obsession after all, but the main problem with it is, to put it bluntly, this isn't actually an adaptation of The Other Boleyn Girl. This was Peter Morgan's attempt at writing the first half of his Henry VIII ITV series into a movie with some seriously miscast leads. Scarlett Johansson is probably the best known actress to play Mary Boleyn, and you have no idea how much I've wanted to rant about this. When I started this channel, it was initially just going to be a series of videos bitching about this movie. But overall, I think the casting of the sisters was the wrong way around. Natalie Portman should have played Mary Boleyn, and Scarlett Johansson should have played Anne Boleyn. And I base that mostly on watching all of the MCU right up until Black Widow. At that point, I just don't care anymore. Johansson is. That's it. She just is. I'm not really fond of the way she speaks in this film. It's always this series of gaspy whispers, like the way Liv Tyler sounds in the Lord of the Rings movies. And I just want her to speak up, because I'm eating a cheese toastie while I'm watching this movie, and I can't hear what she says over the sound of my own chewing. The 2003 movie was bad, but I honestly hate this movie more for what a sheer waste it was. And of course, because of the existence of the 2003 movie, Morgan borrowed several elements from it to fill out the plot. But literally all of the Anne Boleyn and Henry scenes are lifted out of the ITV series. This is the only resemblance you're going to see between the film and the book. I'm fairly sure the only reason they stuck to the Anne being the older sister as stated in the book was because Natalie Portman is 3 years older than Scarlett Johansson. It's the supporting cast I mostly feel sorry for. Seasoned actors like Mark Rylance and Kristen Scott Thomas deserve better. Luckily, Rylance got that, and every time I watch Wolf Hall and there's a scene where Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Boleyn meet, all I see is that Spider-Man meme. But need I remind you, this movie came out in the early careers of Benedict Cumberbatch and Eddie Redmayne, and my god, I am so glad and relieved that they got to go far after this, because if this was all they had to their legacy, it would have sucked. Both movies only have Mary give birth to a son by Henry, only for that triumph to be snatched away by Anne. They barely acknowledge Catherine Carey's existence at all, mostly because she's a girl, and daughters are so easy to forget. But the 2008 movie cares so little about Mary, the title character, that there are deleted scenes showing Mary and William Carey reuniting and giving birth to her daughter and her husband's death by sweating sickness. I'm serious, William Carey's death is not mentioned at all in the cut of the movie that you get on DVD and streaming services. So when Stafford shows up and proposes to Mary, it's never acknowledged that she's widowed. Times I've watched this with friends, I actually had to explain, oh no, her husband's dead by now. They just didn't include that. Oh, and let's talk about the ending scenes of the 2008 movie. Mary is too late to save George, mostly because, though she was apparently living in Rochford, which is in Essex, she rode to London via the Peak District. Maybe Mary just had to stop by for that Blue John ice cream to motivate her into begging for her sister's life. I don't know. I've always wanted to try the Blue John ice cream. Anyway, so she begs Henry to spare Anne, then she goes to see Anne in the Tower of London. Anne says, look after Elizabeth. Anne is executed, and then Mary is seen storming through the court, catching everyone's eye, and she picks up Elizabeth and walks out with her. No doubt, planning to raise Elizabeth away from the court and teaching her the ways of the Force, that she may one day return and reclaim her kingdom. The lack of fucks given in the ending is just cringeworthy, especially when you look at the history behind it, and realise that Mary never saw Elizabeth again after Anne's execution. Rather than end triumphantly, it's just a massive womp womp.
Ask our beloved father.
Lots of dangerous lies are spoken about love. And when I look at our poor sister Mary, who made the mistake of loving our king, well, I realise how precious that security is.
Her name is Mary Boleyn, the daughter of the ambassador, with her sister Anne. I call Mary my English mare because I ride her so often.
Anne, you really should get out more. Part essential here, and all you do is sit and read.
This category usually applies to when the narrative primarily revolves around Anne, or she's a major character. Mary, by contrast, is a small part, and is likely to disappear off the face of the earth later on. Let's start with the first Mary Boleyn to appear on screen, Valerie Guerin in Anne of the Thousand Days. At the start of the film, this Mary is already Henry's mistress, but not for much longer. Once he has his eye on Anne, she is swept aside, but at no point does she ever blame Anne for this, however. She even advises her sister to resist the king. Mary is the best argument not to give in to the king's desires, as she is living proof what happens when he gets bored of her. There is no debate as to the parentage of her child, showing that not even having a royal bastard with the king will mean favour forever. Her family, meanwhile, leave her out in the cold, still accommodating her, but ignoring her feelings over the situation, while pushing all their expectations onto Anne, after which Mary becomes more of a background character. She is seen briefly following the birth of Elizabeth, but that's about it. I can't find her in any other scene, which includes most, if not the entire court. And of course, because Peter Morgan rips a lot from pre-existing dramas when he's writing anything Tudor related, when it came to the ITV Henry VIII, he pulled from the only version of Mary available at that time. Mary, played by Claire Cameron, appears only in a few small scenes at the beginning of the series, establishing pretty much the same beats as Anne of the Thousand Days, but with more attention afforded to Henry. Gone is the emotional depth needed to make Mary more memorable. And that's all I got for this series. Let's move on, before it's too late. In a post-Other Boleyn girl world, more effort was made to give Mary more screen time, and this leads into the Tudors and blood, sex and royalty. Oh joy. And oh my god, I cannot remember the last time I talked about the Tudors. I've really missed it after having to watch so much crap recently. In the Tudors, the better portrayal of the two, Mary is played by Perdita Weeks. She is mostly a vehicle in order to introduce Anne. Francois I recommends Mary to Henry during the Field of the Cloth of Gold, referencing the English mare nickname. But it's also a well thought out plan by the Duke of Norfolk and Thomas Boleyn, who deliver the treasonous Duke of Buckingham to Henry on a silver platter at the same time. However, their relationship doesn't last long, which leads to Boleyn looking to Anne to further the family's interests. In Season 2, Mary is a minor character, but still present for her sister's triumphs. In the Calais episode, she and Mark Smeaton discuss their single status, and this is the first reference towards William Carey's existence, even if it's just about his off-screen death. Mary's also present at Anne's coronation, and is the one to hold Elizabeth during her christening. Her final scene comes in episode 5 of Series 2, where she has married William Stafford off-screen and is pregnant. This happens at the same time Thomas Boleyn is in the room, and it is their father's pressuring that makes Anne push her sister away. Canonically, this is the last that is seen of her, although there was a deleted scene where Mary spoke to Cromwell quoting the begging her bread letter. Thematically, Mary's departure showed Anne becoming increasingly isolated. It did confuse me, however, that Mary is meant to be the older sister here, and yet Natalie Dormer is 2 years older than Perdita Weeks, and you can see that. Or it's probably just because Perdita Weeks, probably not now, but during that time, was able to snag roles where she played a lot younger than she actually was. But she's definitely one of the more accurate Marys you're going to get. Conversely, a word I've never used outside of a school essay, the Mary Boleyn we meet in Blood, Sex and Royalty is similar but not nearly as sympathetic. Not a single character in that series was sympathetic, mind you. I know I had that rule about not including documentary reenactments, but clearly this wanted to be a drama first, with the docu part sprinkled in to legitimise its content. And it failed. Lois Brabin Platt is introduced making herself look sexy enough for the French king, but it's done in contrast to Anne reading a book to emphasise that Anne is not like other girls. No, she's not going off to have orgies with the king like her sister. Mary then becomes Henry's mistress, only to be abandoned by him and become pregnant, not knowing if the baby is actually his. But something I noticed was they never established that she was married at the time, otherwise it hints that Mary slept around with several men, which is why she doesn't know who her baby daddy is. This is as cautionary as it gets for Anne, which then leads to her refusing Henry. Later in episode 3, Mary reappears while Anne is trying to pull herself together after her miscarriage. Anne is furious with her sister for making her look bad, and thinks Mary married against her family's wishes out of spite and jealousy over Henry. Mary replies that Henry never loved her, and it won't be long before he does the same to Anne. A little on the nose, but still poignant.
I don't care, Anne. I've never loved him. He never really wanted me. It's not going to be long until he doesn't want you either.
I had heard a rumour.
She isn't. I would know. If she thickened at all, I'd be the one to have to let out her clothes. I know her waist by the inch.
At last, I can come back to Wolf Hall. In a story told from the perspective of Thomas Cromwell, each member of the Boleyn family are presented as equally ambitious and conniving. Mary Boleyn is a useful asset to Cromwell, however, as she can provide insider details of Anne's personal life. Mary is played by Charity Wakefield. She is introduced in the same scene as Anne, approaching Cromwell after his impressive battle of words with her sister. She immediately takes a liking to Thomas, and divulges that Anne and Henry haven't slept together yet. Mary's attraction to Cromwell, however, is all one-sided. He's sympathetic enough to hear her plight when she confides in him that Anne sees her as an example of what happens when one gives in to Henry. But he's only really attracted to Jane Seymour. In Calais, Mary comes to Cromwell to tell him that Anne and Henry are finally doing the deed, and they very nearly almost get it on themselves, only to be interrupted by William Stafford, whom Mary had agreed to meet beforehand. There was meant to be a final scene with Mary which ended up getting cut. This was meant to take place after she had married Stafford and was being cast out by her family for it. Cromwell arrives in Mary's soon-to-be former lodgings, where she is packing up her belongings with the help of Jane Seymour. Hello, now Sasha's here. Mary realises she can't use the trunks with the Boleyn crests on them, or all her stuff will be cast out, so she and Jane decide to use the bed curtains as sacks. Mary comes back into the room to find Seymour and Cromwell close to one another, which is just another blow for Mary. I like that this Mary wasn't made to be an innocent. She got to be as sassy as her sister. Cromwell's view of her seems to be that while she is barking up the wrong tree, she wasn't all that bad. Probably the best of her family. And there's one more Mary I want to talk about. You know I love inventing/drawing six personas, right? That is, people from history redesigned for the aesthetic of the musical Six. There was a design of Mary Boleyn by Caro Caff 97 on YouTube, and an animatic done to the tune of Good For You from Dear Evan Hansen. The animatic shows the fallout of Mary's second marriage being found out, where Anne, George and Jane Boleyn are all angry/jealous that she defies social expectation. The whole thing turns out to be a nightmare of Mary's, following the executions of her siblings and sister-in-law, a dark family chapter which still haunts her. The use of the bee necklaces are a nice touch. Anne Boleyn's famous bee necklace was one of the most memorable things about her, but in the Sixth universe, any character who met their end via beheading is always seen wearing a choker with one of their initials. Mary starts the animatic wearing a bee choker, only to have it snatched from her and trodden on. It's a symbol of Mary's disownment, but also a signifier of her escaping the fate of the others. The designs of George and Jane are also pretty interesting, but I'll comment on those if I ever get round to doing a video about them.
So you got what you always wanted.
There is a portrait in the Royal Collection showing an unnamed woman in a gabled hood and a black gown that's trimmed with ermine. Another version of the portrait can be found at Hever Castle. The Royal Collection portrait was recreated in the 17th century after the original was lost. Nonetheless, these images have been commonly attributed to Mary Boleyn. As recently as 2020, historians managed to confirm both portraits are of Mary, thanks to forensic analysis, as well as the fact that Mary's descendants own the Hever Castle painting, which matches the Royal Collection miniature. Indeed, thanks to her husband's status and the titles her father was claimant to, Mary would have been permitted to wear something as fine as ermine, as well as wear a gold necklace with a pearl. It is possible that Henry commissioned the portrait while Mary was his mistress. Comparing them with the portraits made of Anne Boleyn after her death, one can see some family resemblance between the two. They have the same brown eyes and their nose has a similar shape. However, because Mary is seen wearing a gabled hood, it is almost impossible to guess what her hair colour might have been. Her eyebrows are quite visible, so that leads me to believe she might not have been pale blonde, dark blonde to brunette at the very most. Mary's on-screen counterparts, with a few exceptions, always tend to present Mary with blonde hair. Perdita Weeks is the only non-cameo Mary to appear as a brunette. Visually it is obvious why this choice was made. Anne must always be the dark brunette, there is no way of avoiding that. But in order to create visual contrast with her sister, the only logical answer is to make her blonde. Sometimes they go one further, where Anne has dark hair and eyes, while Mary is blonde with blue eyes. This kind of gene distribution with offspring of the same parents is rare, but possible. However, this can trickle into the misogyny, especially where the other Boleyn girl is concerned. Anne becomes the dark, immoral temptress. Insecure over her position, her obedient, good-hearted sister receives much of her scorn. But overall, through the power of just not doing much of anything, followed by marrying for love, Mary is the one who gets to walk away with her head while Anne's vices come back to haunt her, and the inevitable execution is almost like karmic retribution. Henry is still this manifestation of cruelty, but said cruelty seems to affect Mary more than it does Anne, the wife he murdered. Granted, because of the vagueness of Mary Boleyn's actual hair colour, I don't mind what your Mary looks like, so long as this kind of Madonna whore complex is avoided in the future. It's not a full-on depiction of the trope sometimes because Mary was the first one to sleep with Henry, but the judgment on her is lessened somewhat because her family forced her into that position, rather than Anne, who aims to gain more from the king than a few favours. But it still divides the sisters and tries to make them enemies when they appeared to be rather close up until when Mary married William Stafford. While there are always stories of famous people who live long lives and die peacefully, history lovers will always be more drawn to those who lived hard and died young and or violently. Anne Boleyn wasn't forgotten because she not only convinced Henry to break from Rome and start the Church of England, but she was also the first Queen of England to be publicly executed. George Boleyn was not forgotten because he was accused alongside his sister and was executed not long before she too went to her death. Not only that, but being the brother of the Queen, he was a notable person at court in his own right. Even the brothers of Jane Seymour stood apart from their sister, mostly because they too were executed, but also because they gained a lot of political influence in their lifetime. Mary Boleyn and Anne of Cleves, among others, have something in common. History does not remember them in more detail because they decided not to play the game anymore. Even Mary's sister-in-law Jane is more well known because she would be executed less than 6 years after the Boleyns' downfall. Jane didn't want to leave the court life behind. In her way, she kept playing until it killed her. Potentially, Henry might have allowed Mary to come back to court and serve one of his other wives, or Elizabeth. However, if she looked enough like her sister, it might have brought up too many uncomfortable memories. Jane Boleyn at least had the excuse of only being associated with them through marriage, whereas Mary could not escape her heritage. But after everything her family went through, can anyone blame Mary for not wanting to get involved? She at least had a family that she'd chosen to create, and while they weren't living in luxury anymore, they still managed to secure a match for Catherine Carey to Sir Francis Knollys in 1540. I do believe that Mary was indeed too traumatised to associate with the royal court again. Further records about her are obscure, mostly due to the loss of documents to the winds of time, as well as historians' interests leaning more towards Henry's antics and who was on the chopping block that week. Still, just because Mary didn't have a notorious ending like her siblings, it doesn't mean her story needs to be tossed out. There isn't really much one can do with Mary Boleyn in order to make her a more compelling character. Her appearance in Wolf Hall gave her more of a personality. She's someone who reveals what it's like being part of such a family. Their affection is conditional, as long as you're useful. Mary, as I said, is mostly a character to whom things happen. She makes very few decisions of her own besides her choice of a second husband. And that ultimately does result in a weak protagonist. Hello. You're a bit late for laps, aren't you? I've been visited by all 3 cats in the span of this recording. I don't mind some more fictional elements one can bring from telling her story. For example, if Henry and Catherine Carey are actually the kings, it adds a flare of envy and dread to Anne's story as she struggles to sire an heir. Likewise, I would not mind if a future Tudor drama features a scene before Anne's execution where Mary visits her sister and they share a brief reconciliation, letting Anne atone for at least one of her mistakes before she dies. And also, one thing I'd like to see is not to have the sisters pitted against each other. Anne's already got Catherine of Aragon and Jane Seymour. What I don't want to see in future is a Mary who is either forgotten or swept under the rug. It'd be nice to have some closure for once. As much as I dislike the 2008 Other Boleyn Girl and ITV Henry VIII, at least it gave us one positive thing. Its casting meant that, for the climax of Black Widow, Mary Boleyn broke her own nose just to kick Henry VIII in the face. And I think we achieved something from that. I don't know what we achieved, but something. So now I've covered Mary Boleyn, someone who I've been waiting literal years to talk about, I wonder if I should move on to George. And what about Jane Boleyn? Should she and George share a video, the same way they shared each other's fate? Mary Boleyn is an integral piece in the big puzzle of Tudor history, so to leave her out or undersell her is to leave the puzzle incomplete. Elizabeth I would not have been declared legally illegitimate if not for her, leading to many of her struggles to keep her throne. But also, had Mary Boleyn not been there would have been no Lettice Knollys for Robert Dudley to secretly marry, nor a Robert Devereux. As long as there are Anne Boleyn dramas to make, Mary Boleyn will be along for the ride, and I just hope they'll be good. When was the last time we had a good Anne? I don't know, but I can say it's been more than a decade. So that was Mary Boleyn. This was a decision made by my patrons on Patreon page. So if you are a patron and I put a new poll up deciding what the next subject is going to be, then all patrons, no matter which tier they sign up to, will get a chance to vote on the next subject. So as soon as I started production on this Mary Boleyn video, I put out a new poll, and this one is for either Robert Dudley, Edward VI, Henry VII, or George Boleyn with a follow-up video about Jane Boleyn. Kill 2 birds with 1 stone, or with 1 axe if it's more appropriate. And the winner for the latest poll, which will be the next one done project, which hopefully will be covered in November, is my boy Robert Dudley. So that's another Typecast Tudor, will be another one and done project. I'm trying to do more one and done projects because they seem to get more attention in the algorithm. So a subject that's started and finished in a single video, I can understand why that's more preferable to watch. Okay, so let me quickly summarise what videos are going to come up for the rest of the year. So I was glad I got this out fairly early in October, so that leaves me the rest of the month to both work on this Robert Dudley video as well as do another literary hot takes for Halloween. And I've announced it several times in previous videos, but if you're new to the channel, if this is your first video you've logged on to and it's not Halloween of 2024 yet, the video you're getting will be a hot takes on The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. But either way, after that, in early November I want the Robert Dudley video out, and then there will be another subsequent video coming out after Robert Dudley. I really want to do a Christmas Carol hot take. I was thinking last year that I could do one video for every day of December, but even if I wasn't working Panto this year, I would have to have started work on that back in June. We'll probably just do 10 adaptations, or even maybe 15 that are either really popular or mean something personally to me. So I want to do the Christmas Carol adaptation. Maybe I could do a thing where if I've got 8,000 subscribers by the time I get to Robert Dudley, I can do my 8,000 subscriber special, which will be the Wolf Hall trilogy, and then at the same time work on these Christmas Carol hot takes and have that come out in December. If you want to make sure that you don't miss any of the upcoming videos, please make sure you subscribe and make sure this video goes far in the algorithm. Give it likes, give it comments, share it around. Here's a thought: if you made it to the end of the video, comment what your favourite Halloween movie is. And another way you can support my channel is by becoming a patron. You will have access to a Discord and your name in the credits of every video I make, and the higher the tier you contribute to, the more benefits you get. So you will get early access to my scripts and early access to videos. Sometimes if there's a video that I really have to censor it and cut it down to meet YouTube's guidelines, you'll get the uncensored version. I've been cutting down on my swearing, but even then I could watch something really bad and swear my effing head off. And if you're a top tier contributor, you will get a shout out at the end of every video. Thank you so much. Annalise Barnett, Anna from Gustine, Jill My Nero, Larissa and Leslie Williams. So I will see you next time for Phantom of the Opera and my boy Robert Dudley.